We are in Daniel, the 11th chapter this morning, and if you recall, we mentioned at the end of last Sunday's study that we would be going to chapter 11. In fact, at the end of chapter 6 is where we indicated we would be going to chapter 11. Now, the reason why we're doing this is we're following Rex Turner Sr.'s chronology, which I think he's correct in the sense that Daniel chronologically is not in order, the way it's organized. You have chapters 1 through 4, of course, that are in chronological order, but then from that point on, you've got it out of chronological order. And that's the way it is for beginning with chapter 11. By the time you come to Daniel chapter 11, Daniel himself is about 91 or 92 years old. And it begins, verse 1, "Also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him." Now, many commentators would affirm that Daniel chapters 11 and 12 are in chronological order. But if you were to get Brother Turner's commentary, which I heartily recommend that you do, he goes into some detail talking about why the Darius the Mede of chapter 11 is not the same as the Darius who is mentioned at the end of chapter 6. At the end of chapter 6 it says, "This Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian." And so in chapter 11 verse 1, "in the first year of Darius the Mede." Commentators, older commentators especially, have assumed that this Darius was the same Darius. But there have been more recent discoveries, archaeological discoveries and otherwise, that indicate that these are two different Dariuses. In other words, this Darius would be, I believe, Ugbaru, and this Darius in chapter 11, verse 1 is Gubaru. Don't ask me where they got their names, but that is what is the case. And I would point you to Brother Turner's commentary for the details concerning this. Now, who is the one that is talking here in chapter 11, verse 1? If you are to assume that chapter 10 is prior to chapter 11, as is the case normally in commentaries and in the way the book is organized, you would assume that this is Michael, your prince, at the end of chapter 10. But that's not necessarily the case. It is not Daniel. We know that to be the fact. It would be an angel. Now, Michael in chapter 10, verse 21 is an angel. But this person who is speaking in chapter 11, verse 1 is an angel, but we're not necessarily told who this angel is. But at any rate, this angel is the one who is revealing this vision to Daniel as an older man. So he stood to confirm and to strengthen him. Strengthening Daniel, in other words. Verse 2, "And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia." Greece. This 4th king would be far greater than the others who had come before him. And what's more, he would stir up all the region of Greece. Now, who does this describe? It can describe no one but Xerxes. King Xerxes, or as he is also known in the Old Testament, Ahasuerus. It's the same as is mentioned in the book of Esther. At the beginning of the book of Esther, we read about this Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, who was going to show off his wife, Queen Vashti, before a drunken party, and she refused to do that because she was very modest And then as a result, he punished all the women of the kingdom because of the advice that he got from his advisors. Well, we know what that was leading up to. Chapter 1 of the book of Esther was leading up to his invasion of Greece. He would try to go in and conquer the realm of Greece, and we know what happened because of that. He was repulsed eventually. He was repulsed both in the sea and on the land. After extended battles, and of course, if you've ever heard of the 300 who stood in the gap, well, Leonidas and his Spartans delayed the Persians for a time where the Greeks could then regather their forces and then effectively oppose Xerxes. And after extended battles, they were thrown out of Greece with their tail between their legs. So when you come to Esther chapter 2, you find a totally different mood for the king than you find in chapter 1. Chapter 1, he's thinking the battle's already won before he's even fought it. Chapter 2, he's a very humbled king because he's been repulsed, he's been beaten. Well, as a result of stirring up the realm of Greece, which he did, verse 3 of our chapter here in Daniel says, "And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will." Because of what Xerxes would do, a great king would stand up. Who is this great king? Is none other than Alexander the Great. Alexander accomplished a tremendous amount in the very short life that he lived. He only lived for about 33 years. And in that very short life, he was able to expand the Grecian Empire all the way from the Mediterranean to the very border of India itself. We've already gone through this a little bit in our class already, because Daniel's already mentioned Alexander in his visions. Here he does again mention Alexander. Alexander was the one who brought up the city of Alexandria in Egypt, one of the largest libraries known to man at that time. Alexander was able to introduce the Greek language worldwide, and eventually, when you come down to the first century, we have the Greek language as the lingua franca of the Roman Empire, and it is, in fact, the language of the New Testament. So Alexander contributed a lot to culture and contributed his own element to making things happen for the Messiah to come in when the times would be right. And that, of course, the language, the universal language, would help toward that end. But verse 4 of our chapter says, "And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others besides those." So when Alexander was at his moment of zenith, as far as his empire was concerned, when he was at his strongest point, he dies. Brother Turner mentions, and he mentions this because of what ancient commentators have said about Alexander, that Alexander apparently adopted the Persian lifestyle personally. That is to say, he was involved in much drinking and was involved in much debauchery. And because of those things, Alexander suddenly dies, and his kingdom is not given to his posterity. His wife is expecting a baby at the time that he dies, but here the kingdom is now in flux. There's no definite heir to the throne, as it were. And so, as it is, it's divided toward the four winds of heaven. This would indicate it's divided between Macedonia, Thrace, Asia, and Egypt. The four winds of heaven, as it were. And then it says, not to his posterity, his kingdom shall be plucked up. It would be given to his four generals, the Diadochi. They would be the ones who would divide up the kingdom amongst themselves. It would be divided between Cassander, Antigonus, Lysimachus, and Ptolemy. Basically. There are a couple of others that tried to take over some regions of the empire. But basically, the four regions were Cassandra, Antigonus, Lysimachus, and Ptolemy. And so verse 5 says, the king of the south. Now here is where our premillennial friends go completely off the rails. Our premillennial friends say, you see, this refers to the end of time where you've got the king of the south down here in Israel, the king of the north up there in Russia, and they're all going to come together there in Israel at the Battle of Armageddon. That is so far from the truth, it ain't even funny. Excuse the bad grammar. But the fact is, the king of the south, in context here, is referring to Ptolemy I of Egypt. He reigned from about 323 to 306. The king of the south shall be strong. He would be strong over Egypt, in other words. And one of his princes. His princes refers to Alexander's princes. This would refer to Seleucus Nicator, who had Syria under his control from about 312 to 280. And he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. And in the end of years, that is, sometime later, they shall join themselves together. For the king's daughter of the south, this would refer to Bernice, shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. Marriage, in other words. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm. The marriage would not last, in other words. But she shall be given up, that is, she would die. And they that brought her, and he that begat her, that is her father, and he that strengthened her in these times. But out of a branch of her roots, that's Bernice's roots, shall one stand up in his estate or place, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. Bernice's progeny, in other words, would rise up and become king of the south, and then would come against the king of the north, Syria, and would prevail over the king of the north. And shall also carry away captives into Egypt, their gods, with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold. And he shall continue more years than the king of the north. In this period of time, there will be no active hostilities between Egypt and Syria. It would be an enforced peace, in other words. So the king of the south, by this time, this is Seleucus Calenus of Syria, shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his own land. This is after 2 years. But his sons, this would refer to Cyrannus and Antiochus the Great, shall be stirred up, or they shall war, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces. And one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. And the king of the south, this is by this point Ptolemy Philopater, shall be moved with choler, or anger, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. This indicates that even though Ptolemy has a smaller army, he would defeat Antiochus the Great. Verse 12, and when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up. And he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. That is, he would not follow up on that great victory that he would gain. For the king of the north, Syria, shall return and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army with much riches. About 14 years later, in other words, Ptolemy Epiphanes desired to retake Syria. He wanted to go back and retake what they had before. Verse 14. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers, or the children of the violent of thy people, shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fail. In other words, Palestine itself is caught in the middle of all this. During all of this back and forth between Syria and Egypt following Alexander the Great's death, and these different rulers who would rise up and try to conquer or retake all of what Alexander had, Palestine will be right there in the middle of all of it. And those Palestinians, those Jews who desire to compromise with the Greeks, would be the ones who would try to be on top of everything. All those who oppress the Jews, in other words, is what he's talking about here. So the king of the north, at this point, this refers to Antiochus the Great, shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced cities. And the arms of the south, that's Ptolemy, shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. But he that cometh against him, again, this is Antiochus the Great, shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. In other words, he would take not only Syria, but he would also take Judea. He would be the one to take Palestine. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. That is, he wanted to take Egypt. He's got Syria, he's got Judea, and now he wants to go into Egypt. And upright ones with him. Thus shall he do. And he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her. Now this refers to Cleopatra. This is not the Cleopatra that we're familiar with of Mark Antony's time. This is a different Cleopatra. This is one that came way before the Cleopatra we're familiar with. But she shall not stand on his side. That is, she would not stand with his father. Neither be for him. That is, she would be for her husband, not for her father. After this shall he turn his face unto the isles. Now we're, and time frame at this point, we're about 193 BC. And so by now he wants to turn his face toward the isles, that is Asia Minor, and shall take many. But a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach he shall cause it to turn upon him. By this point Rome is beginning to rise up as a major player. It's not to the point where they would be in the first century, the dominant superpower, but Rome is a power to reckon with. And Rome is increasingly now going to be a thorn in Syria's side. Syria wants to have worldwide expansion. Rome is saying, nope, you're not going to do that. So that's what you're seeing all of a sudden develop at this point. Then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. He would try to sue for peace with the Romans, that is Antiochus the Great, but he would then die in battle. And one of the battles that he was prosecuting, he was killed. So that does away with Antiochus the Great. Then, verse 20, shall stand up in his estate or his place a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom. This refers to Heliodorus. But within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. That is, he would die. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom. But he shall come in peaceably, or in time of security, and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Now this vile person refers to none other than Antiochus IV Epiphanes. We've mentioned Antiochus IV Epiphanes before in our intertestamental period study that we had a while back on Wednesday nights. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was filled with hatred against the Jews. His name, Epiphanes, meant the glorious one. But the Jews, as given as they were to sarcasm and to puns, they took that name Epiphanes and changed it to Epimanes, which meant the vile person. Well, that very much described Antiochus. If you have done any study at all on Antiochus IV, you know what we're talking about. He usurped the kingdom itself, that is the Syrian kingdom, from Demetrius, and had it for himself at this point. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken. Yea, also the prince of the covenant. That is, he would not always hold his political position. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, that is, Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. He would rise up from small beginnings to the position that he would have. He shall enter peaceably, or in time of security, even upon the fattest places of the province. And he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey, and spoil, and riches. Yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. Again, I encourage you to do some study about Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, and see what his practice was when he would conquer a territory or conquer a people. It was horrible, horrible indeed. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. He's wanting to cast his eyes down toward Egypt. He's the king of Syria. He's now gone through Palestine, and now he wants to take Egypt and have that whole section of the empire for himself. He's going up against Ptolemy Philopater at this point, or Ptolemy Philopater. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. That is, there were close people who would betray Ptolemy Philopater. And as a result, Antiochus IV Epiphanes would indeed come in and take Egypt. And both these kings' hearts, that is, Antiochus IV and Ptolemy Philopater, shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. In other words, in all of this, God is still in control. Then shall he, that is Antiochus IV Epiphanes, return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. Comes back to Syria, swollen with all this wealth and riches from his campaign, and now he's moved against the Israelites. And he shall do exploits, or shall do his pleasure, and return to his own land. This is the first or the second invasion that he would make to the south. At the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south. That is, he would be involved in a fourth invasion of Egypt, because Egypt would not remain docile under his control. They would strive to overthrow him. And so he would have to return several times to Egypt to try to maintain the order as he would see it, and try to rule with an iron fist. But it says it shall not be as the former or as the latter. In other words, it's going to be different. For the ships of Chittim shall come against him. Now, who are the ships of Chittim? The ships of Chittim refer to Rome. Rome would be involved at this point. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence or regard unto them that forsake the holy covenant. In other words, this last invasion of Egypt, Rome meets him and says, you're not going to have Egypt. In fact, they literally draw a circle around him, a very famous scene. They draw a circle around him in the sand and say, you are going to pledge to us that you're not going to take this land before you step out of this circle. Rome meant business, and Rome was strong enough to mean business. And so Antiochus IV's hand was forced. And of course he had to make that pledge that he would withdraw from Egypt. Well, that caused him to be filled with all sorts of indignation. And so we come to verse 30. Well, at the end of verse 30, he has regard to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. That is, those Jews who desired a Grecian way of life. He's going to be very friendly to them, and he's filled with anger against those Jews who reject Syrian mastery. Verse 31, and arms shall stand on his part. That is, Jews who forsook the way of the covenant. And they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength. That refers to temple worship. They would pollute temple worship. And shall take away the daily sacrifice. The daily sacrifice here refers to what Moses instituted through inspiration of the Holy Spirit in Exodus 29:39. And they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Jesus talks about the abomination of desolation that standeth in the holy place in Matthew 24, referring there to the Romans who would stand there in the very place where the temple stood. They would destroy the temple and they would stand there as they did during Antiochus's day. Well, this refers to this very incident where the Syrians come through, led by Antiochus IV, and they actually start offering pigs on the altar. The abomination that maketh desolate. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and shall do exploits. That is, the people who are wanting to be faithful to God, they would be in the minority at this point. They would do heroic acts. And if you've ever studied anything about the intertestamental period, especially the Maccabean revolt, you know that is exactly what took place. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, by captivity, and by spoil many days. There will be persecution as long as Antiochus IV was in power. And indeed that was the case. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help. But many shall cleave to them with flatteries. By this point, Judas Maccabeus would rise up, instigated by his father who resisted offering the abomination that makes desolate upon the altar. Judas Maccabeus' father would actually kill the representative of Syria who wanted them to do that, and that would be the spark that would ignite the Maccabean revolt. Judas Maccabeus, nicknamed the Hammer, would lead the Jewish people to several massive victories. And every time his army was smaller than Syria. And yet the tactics that he used are still studied by the Israeli army even to this day, because of how he was able to be victorious over the Syrians. First and Second Maccabees describes all of this in great detail. Not inspired, of course, but very interesting historically. So verse 33, verse 34. Verse 35, actually, sorry. And some of them of understanding shall fall to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. Persecution always does that. Persecution always tries, purges, and makes white. Isn't that the case in the first century? The persecution of the Lord's church by the Romans? By the Jews first and then by the Romans? Isn't that what really happened? It really strengthened the church. And if we ever go through a period of time in our country, and it could very well happen in the future, where we go through actual persecution, not the kind of persecution that is of a verbal nature or a kind of persecution where you're have a lot of pressure put on you to conform. I'm talking about actual persecution, physical persecution, where your life is threatened. If we ever go through that kind of persecution again, it will do nothing more than strengthen the Lord's church. I have no doubt about that, because it will show who is really going to be faithful to God and who is not. And that's what happened here with the Jews. This time of persecution weeded out those who were unfaithful as opposed to those who were faithful. And the king shall do according to his will. And he shall exalt himself, and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. Now, Brother Turner asks the question, I think appropriately so, does this refer to Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes or a great Antichrist that will come at the end of time? Now, many of our religious friends would say this refers to a great Antichrist. And that we're told because the book of Revelation tells us about the Antichrist. Really? Does it? Does Revelation tell us about Antichrist? Can you find the word Antichrist in the book of Revelation? No, you can't. Well, we're talking about the beast. Okay, now you're talking about the beast of Revelation. But the beast is not Antichrist. Why? Because 1 John tells us, in 1 John chapter 2 particularly, it says, you have heard that Antichrist must come. Even so, there are now many Antichrists. John says at the time he is writing this book, there are many Antichrists. He says, who is Antichrist but those who deny that Jesus is come in the flesh? That's who Antichrist is. Yes, but I'm talking about a big Antichrist. John doesn't talk about a big Antichrist. He says even now there are many Antichrists. And even now in our day there are many Antichrists, are there not? Are there not people that deny that Jesus ever existed? Of course. Brother Ralph Gilmore Freed-Hardeman debated one such person 2 or 3 years ago up in West Virginia who denies that Jesus is a historical person. And in fact, there's a lot of people, more than you think, that believe that Jesus is a myth. That's Antichrist. If you say that Jesus Christ has not come in the flesh, you are, present tense, Antichrist. Well, I'm talking about the beast. Well, now that's a different subject altogether. Who is the beast of Revelation? That's a different subject for a different study. Is that what Daniel is talking about here? No. He's talking about Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes. Keep it in context. We've got to keep this in context. He's talking about Antiochus the Fourth, who would do according to his will. Indeed he did. Who would exalt himself. Oh yes. And magnify himself above every god. You better believe it. And speak marvelous things against the God of gods. No doubt. And shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. And he very much did that. Verse 37, neither shall he regard the God or gods that would be of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. That's exactly what Antiochus did. Antiochus was that kind of person. But in his estate, or his place, shall he honor the God of forces, or the God of fortresses. And a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and with precious stones and pleasant things. He would exalt pagan gods over Jehovah, in other words. He have no regard for the God of Israel. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory. And he shall cause them to rule over many and shall divide the land for gain. In other words, what Antiochus would do is he would exalt a strange god. And by all accounts, this god had a very similar likeness to Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes. Is that a shock? Well, no. He considered himself to be a god. Just as Domitian would consider himself to be a god toward the end of the first century. Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes had that same attitude. Saddam Hussein apparently had that kind of grandiose vision of himself. He saw himself as a modern-day Nebuchadnezzar. That was what he tried to position himself as. When you have somebody in that kind of position with that much power, they begin to have very inflated views of themselves. And that's the way it was with Antiochus IV. And at that time, now what he does here in verses 40 through 45 is he reviews. He reviews what he's just gone over with Daniel. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south, Egypt, push at him. And the king of the north, Syria, shall come against him like a whirlwind, that is, with a show of power, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he, that is Antiochus, shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. That is, through deceit Antiochus would prevail. He shall enter also into the glorious land, that's Jerusalem, but many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. Now there's no reason stated here for this by the angel to Daniel. He just makes this statement. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. Antiochus IV Epiphanes came very close to being the king of all. Came very close to realizing his vision. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Robbing the riches of the countries that he conquered was quite characteristic of this man. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. That is Rome. Out of the north, Rome would be the one to stop him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. That is, he would war. He would go to war because of the anger he had. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. That's Mount Sinai. Yet he shall come to his end. That is, he would come to an inglorious end. And none shall help him. That is to say, Antiochus IV would reap what he had sown. Now that's sort of an overview of this whole situation from verses 40 through 45. From the very beginning of Antiochus IV to the end of Antiochus IV. He's going to go in more detail as we go through the remainder of this book. But this gives you the panoramic picture of what the angel is revealing to Daniel. That gives you the idea, or actually gives you the definite fact, that the Bible is not silent concerning the years between the Old and New Testament. Daniel is the one that foretells exactly what would happen between the close of Malachi and the beginning of Matthew. And we went over all that some months ago on Wednesday nights on the intertestamental period study. And I would encourage you not only to get the commentary from Brother Turner on Daniel, but also to get his intertestamental period notes. I highly recommend that because he goes into detail not only in Daniel but also in Josephus and Maccabees and other historical accounts, tying all of this together, and makes more sense than anybody, I think. And of course Daniel is foretelling all of this. It makes it a lot easier for us to understand, I think, what would happen in between the period of the Testaments. So we're at the end of chapter 11. And what we're going to do next Sunday is go back to chapter 10. Make sense? Well, we're going in chronological order. That is according to Brother Turner, and I think he's very correct about that. And we will give reasons again for this when we take up our study next Sunday morning.